Hello everybody, North here with a video that I'll be explaining and detailing the power scaling of My Hero Academia. In this video, I'll be ranking the series' primary villains based on strength relative to one another. First, I should preface this with a slight explanation on how I'll be deciding who can be considered a primary villain. Keep in mind, this is pretty arbitrary and based on my opinion, so obviously I won't be including any students or heroes, so there won't be any like Bakugo for the Battle Trial arc, or Gang Orca for the hero licensing arc, etc. I looked at a coherent list of arcs, went down, and decided who I thought were the big bads for each of them respectively. The villains I decided to rank are as follows. Also, beware, this video will contain spoilers. Now first, I went with the USJ Nomu for the first main villain in the series. He appeared alongside Shigaraki in a band of fodder villains in the USJ arc, and I decided on him since he'd appear to be the first big threat to the students as well as the teachers. I didn't even consider Shigaraki for this position because he'd both rank pretty low and he also didn't prove as much of a threat at this point in the series. And he'd also appear later on, so it was pretty redundant. Next, of course, is Stain in the Hero Killer arc. Stain is an obvious pick. The arc is literally named after him. I won't really go into too much detail, but he is the first villain we see faced predominantly by the students themselves without any additional help from the teachers. Next is Muscular. This is pretty obvious as well. He seemed like the most dangerous of the Vanguard Action Squad at that point, which included Dobby, Moonfish, and others. And clearly with it even in appearance on the volume cover, that he was intended to be the big bad of the arc. He also faced off with the actual main character in Deku Deku's literal biggest outing at that point in the series, with him having to go beyond 100% of his strength to even beat him. So yeah, this is pretty much a no-brainer. Next, for the Camino in the Hideout Raid arc, we have All For One, of course. Now this won't be prime All For One. This will be All For One at that point in the series when he fought All Might at that particular time. There is no further detail needed. Next is Overhaul for the Yakuza arc. Again, he's the Yakuza boss. The entire arc is centered around the operation to take him down. It's practically named after him. I don't think I really need to explain that even more. For the Cultural Festival arc, we have Gentle Criminal. Pretty self-explanatory. He fought Deku as he tried to crash the festival. I'll be touching on both his base and amped forms. Not like there's much of a difference anyway, but yeah. The next villain will be Hood, or the first high-end, as many would consider him. The entire arc is centered around Hawks and Endeavor fighting him. It's a pretty short arc, only about like 9 chapters or so. But yeah, it should be pretty obvious why he was selected as a primary villain. The next, for My Villain Academia, in an arc where we completely follow the villains. The big bad was Ritastro, of course. He was the boss and the strongest of the Liberation Army. He was the final boss for Shigaraki to overcome at this point. You know, obviously, he was the big bad. Shouldn't need any more detail. And finally, the GOAT himself, Shigaraki. He is the primary villain or antagonist of the current arc. Well, the last arc, rather, since it is wrapping up at this point of recording. The entire war against Hero Society was, of course, sparked by he himself. And he's proven to sit at the top of the throne when it comes to villains in terms of strength. I chose him over the high-ends Gigantomachia and Dobby, as they were all practically just side factors to Shigaraki's monstrous power with his new All For One enhanced body. So yeah, now that we have the villains we'll be ranking. I should say that the listing is based on a few factors. Depending on the context of one's abilities, a pick can be determined by either who would win in a fight, or simply who has feats that solidify higher placements in terms of AP or speed. If you don't know what AP is attack potency, which is generally the strength by which one can attack with, and it also ties into how much of destructive capacity their attacks carry, as well as area of effect. So let's get into it. Coming in at 9, I'm gonna go with Stain. This might be kind of weird, but yeah, Stain really is just like the worst of the main villains in my opinion. Might be kind of controversial, and I guess it would be more contentious when you think about him in comparison to the likes of Gentle and Overhaul, but we'll get to them later. The basic logic behind it is Stain hasn't necessarily shown anything too impressive in terms of actual scaling. We see him scale above Todoroki, Ida, and a 5% Deku, who is obviously inferior to later forms of Deku. Now we know he is faster than each of them, and while not even going all out or trying to kill him, he's easily able to outpace them. He was also shown finessing a Shigaraki that was able to keep up with Eraserhead in the USJ arc. But the issue is, his only real scaling is 5% Deku, And I mean, yeah, he is stronger than 5% Deku. And yeah, I could probably see him from a narrative outlook being comparable to later forms of Deku. And he probably will be if he ever appears in the series again. But based on what he has shown, this is as far as we could probably conclude on how strong he is. Obviously, I don't want to implement any forms of headcanon or arbitrary assessments. So yeah, based on what he has shown, I can only say he scales above 5% Deku. He was also shown getting blitzed by Ida with Reciprocal Burst. With his quirk, he'd easily be able to defeat anyone who he could draw blood from by turns of paralysis, though he'd have to actually be able to land a hit on his opponent to do that. Now, there are two ways you could possibly upscale Stain's speed. One is the instance where he manages to reach and kill a flying Nomu faster than Gran Torino despite being tied up. This wouldn't really work, since not only did Gran Torino not even start the action of chasing a Nomu, it should be known that Stain got completely blitzed by Ida's Reciprocal Burst. Now you may ask, why does that debunk the argument? And well, it would be contradicted by a later statement by Deku, where he claims that Ida's Reciprocal Turbo, which is a far more powerful version of Reciprocal Burst, was as fast as Gran Torino. So if Stain is able to get blitzed by a weaker version of something that is Gran Torino's speed, he obviously shouldn't be considered faster than Gran Torino. A second argument is basically using the first and second databook stats. Though you may see the stats and think they come directly from the author and should be taken with 100% certainty, it should be known that not only are there multiple inconsistencies with the stats, but also that the power scaling in general is up to the interpretation of the readers. And of course, if statements given by the author are blatantly contradicted by what is gathered from the source material, it shouldn't be necessarily viewed as an objective truth. So even though Stain may have a 6 speed stat in the first databook, which is a speed that matches All Might, it obviously isn't true based on his fight with 5% Deku that he was nowhere near All Might speed. Next we have Gentle. Where Stain may come across as faster and more capable with equipment from an eye test, you should keep in mind Deku's encounter with Gentle. Gentle was able to fight an 8% Deku following the Yakuza arc. We know that the difference from 5% to 8% full cow in speed is stated to be several steps faster by Bakugo, and along with Deku's growing mastery of his quirk, this Deku should obviously be far beyond the displayed strength and speed that the Deku we see in Combat Stain. Along with this, he does have Lover Mode, which is stated to amp his strength and I assume his speed by dozens of times. Dozens being between 24 and 96 times, which is an insane range for a multiplier. But it should be known that despite this amp, Gentle was still defeated by the same 8% Deku he'd previously been fighting. So despite showing obvious increase in speed and physical strength, the multiplier stated was clearly a massive exaggeration by Horikoshi. Generally, I think Gentle, especially while in his Lover Mode, would basically just outspeed and zone Stain with its elastic air before knocking him out eventually over time. Also, there's the argument that Gentle was Deku's hardest opponent, but that isn't necessarily valid or relatable to strength. Not only would that be contradicted by blatant scaling, it should also be known that the statement holds no weight when it comes to strength and is mostly in reference to Deku's belief that he could have turned out like Gentle. It's more of a clash of ideals thing than a strength thing. At 7, we're going to have a kind of controversial selection in Redistro. Redistro being someone who could completely decimate city blocks with the strike from his 100% stress empowered attacks. You may wonder why is he so low? Well, first, it's an issue with Muscular. Although he suffers from the same flaw as Stain, which is his lackluster speed scaling, he actually displays one of the best feats in the series where he flats out tanks and matches in a full-on attack from 100% Deku strength. A strength that he even referred to as All Might's power, which can be interpreted in 2 different ways. But in this context, I do think it'd be right to assume that he is referencing his usage of 100% as a strength equaling that of All Might, as opposed to him referencing One for All in itself. So basically, despite being at a disadvantage in terms of speed, generally speaking, there'd be no genuine way for anybody that has appeared on this list up until now to actually hurt Muscular. Also, Redistro's speed should only be really comparable to a Shigaraki who was able to catch an occupied Overhaul off guard, with this feat not necessarily being too impressive, since one Overhaul was literally having a panic attack from being a germaphobe covered in blood, and there also wouldn't be any concrete way to actually scale Shigaraki's speed to Overhaul since he does react despite this, and even calls for a shield, where many may wonder, why didn't he just dodge? I assure you, I asked myself the same thing. Like, it doesn't really make any sense for him not to just dodge, since this random fodder who obviously should be far slower than him, just jumps out of the way and takes a hit in his place and actually dies. Some could argue that Redistro fought Edge Shock, and we actually don't see enough of that fight to have any information on that. But from what we did see, Redistro couldn't even hit Edge Shock without using some form of omnidirectional shockwave-like attack, so he wouldn't scale and speed the Edge Shock. Overall, Redistro is a really strong character, and is likely near higher end in the verse, but I really can't see him beating anybody higher than him, especially considering how unquantifiable his speed is at this point. At 6, I'm going to go a Muscular. I actually had to think about this placement, but I think it sounds about right. Although he was able to take a punch and get back up from 100% Deku, and later match a weaker punch in strength, Muscular suffers in the speed department. Despite the insisting of Horikoshi, who has given Muscular a 5 speed stat on both occasions in both data books, I couldn't assert that based on what he's shown, Muscular should be given any speed higher than what I've seen, which is beyond that of 5% Deku to an unquantifiable degree. Now, whereas with Rita still, I could see Muscular being able to overpower and eventually beat him despite a speed difference, I can't say the same for the others higher on the list. With Rita still also having some weak speed showings as stated earlier, I also think it'd be safe to assume that he wouldn't have an unlimited supply of stress converted energy, as I've deduced would likely have been the lead to his downfall against Deadshot. At 5, I'm going to have to go with Overhaul. I would have really liked to place Overhaul over the likes of Hood because of his obvious one-shot potential, but the speed difference was just too great. Overhaul is casually beyond the likes of Rappa, who can punch at bullet speeds fast enough to fight Overclock from the Vigilante spinoff, and was able to react to and avoid Mirio's attacks on multiple occasions. This same Mirio, who Overhaul himself would claim to be superior to a 20% Deku in terms of speed, who he could also avoid attacks from despite being completely outclassed. With speed scaling to Mirio and above 8% Deku, she'd easily be able to dispatch any of the prior villains with his one-shot potential touch. All it would take is a single finger tap to kill anyone ranked below. This isn't even taking into account his fusions, with his first fusion having enhanced range with 4 arms, and his second fusion having the ability to absorb vitality as well as take hits from 100% full count Deku and forcibly regenerate his own body. Now, there are ways to upscale Overhaul even further. In his second fusion, his underling was earlier shown to be able to display pretty good fighting feats. When empowered by his vitality stealing quirk, he was able to fight Nejire and Ryukyu, who would later be seen fighting All For One Shigaraki and Hyens. I don't really think it will make much sense that a character who many may have forgot even exists should be as fast as Hyens or Shigaraki, but it should also be known that he had absorbed an ungodly amount of vitality from multiple people, so I'll assume that under the same conditions, Overhaul would be just as fast, but only under those conditions, so I won't really count those. There's also the prospect of Mirio scaling to high end in terms of speed, as he's able to easily react to and avoid attacks from them. Though, you could just as easily say Mirio has been training this entire time, between the point where he loses his quirk and gets it back, and knowing his work ethic. That is most likely true, and he's most likely just gotten far faster than he has been in the past. But hey, you can also just call the series out for being inconsistent in terms of scaling. It does tend to come off that way pretty often. Overall, I'd say under normal circumstances, 5 should be an okay spot for Overhaul, but I guess I can touch up on him later in case you want to hear about the other forms of scaling. At 4, I'll go with Hood. I'll touch on the weird inconsistent Nomu ranks in a bit, but first I'll talk about why he's here. So assuming Overhaul isn't getting some weird vitality up or scaling to All For One Shigaraki or something, he basically wouldn't be able to touch Hood. Hood scaling directly to Hawks and Endeavor, with Hawks being narratively implicitly the fastest hero, and Endeavor being among the fastest as well. Endeavor being so fast in fact that not only was he the first to engage All For One Shigaraki, but even went hand to hand with him before Eraserhead could arrive to erase his powers. So Endeavor basically fought and landed attacks on Shigaraki several times while avoiding Shigaraki even landing a touch on him, which would have instantly killed him. That coupled with his regeneration and no one on the list thus far aside from Overhaul would even have a chance at killing him. With the physical strength to beat up Endeavor, who could take attacks from All For One Shigaraki's air cannon, the air cannon being an ability that All For One used to literally rip up city blocks in his fight against All Might, as well as the durability to withstand his own strength. Couldn't even see Muscular being able to kill him if given a chance, unless of course he somehow managed to get a hold of and rips his head off like Mirko did, but even that is iffy since Hood rips his own head off to regenerate a new body anyway. Like, should Mirko have really been able to do that? Anyway, I think this is the correct placement for Hood, assuming Overhaul is too slow to land a finger on him. Okay, 3 has got to be USJ Nomu. And now I'll talk about the wonky Nomu rankings that Horikoshi has put into play. Now, there's 4 levels of Nomu. Low and mid tier Nomu, which are lightly colored grays, whites, and other colors. Then there's upper tier and higher Nomus, which are usually black or really dark blue in the anime. The rankings are generally an indication of the Nomu's quirk count and physical strength, with low and mid tier Nomu giving challenges to minor heroes while being one-shot by the big dogs. Upper tier Nomus are usually equipped with regeneration unlike the lower tiers, and are generally more physically powerful. This is the ranking by which the USJ Nomu would fall under. Now there's Hyens, which are stated to possess superior stats, which would obviously be assumed to be physical, as well as having more quirks and a capacity to act on their own, as well as use deductive skills and learn. There's another tier called Near Hyen, which would match Hyens in terms of physical stats, but would lack the thinking part. So you have USJ Nomu, who can literally go blow for blow with All Might, and even take him aback with its speed, who is an upper tier Nomu. And even when given the explanation for Nomu tiers, Horikoshi goes out of his way to use the same Nomu as a depiction for upper tier. So he goes out of his way he used the USJ Nomu as a depiction for an upper tier. In the very next page, flat out says high-ends are better in every single way. Now you would say, well, USJ Nomu has shock absorption, which is correct. He was able to sustain multiple hits from All Might without actually taking the damage physically. But that doesn't change the fact that he could catch All Might off guard with his speed and also match him in a flurry of punches. So if you want to take what Horikoshi said at face value, Hood and every other high-end and near high-end scales above USJ Nomu, which also means they scale above All Might at the start of the series, which would also mean current Endeavor scales above that All Might, as well as Mirko. But Horikoshi later gives us insight. He goes about and has the doctor literally say Shigaraki, who is stronger than Endeavor, is not as strong as All Might. Huh. Anyway, I love Horikoshi and he's an amazing author. But when it comes to power scaling, he's honestly very inconsistent, which isn't necessarily a flaw, since power scaling isn't a burden that should be undertaken by the author, but rather the audience. Also, Overhaul for some reason was beyond high engine speed. This is where I think he'd place, right below USJ Nomu. Right above USJ Nomu is where I think Wolfram and Nine, the two movie villains, were scaled. I've never actually seen the first movie because I heard it's kind of bad and it looks kind of trash from what I've seen. But from what I've seen, Wolfram should be about here. Nine should likely be beyond him, as he could fight off 100% Deku and Bakugo at once. I do think Nine will be below Shigaraki though, since he is utilizing what is essentially just a weaker version of All For One as compared to Shigaraki's, who could also react to 100% Deku, but couldn't avoid his attacks due to being suspended in the air while restricted by Black Whip. Anyway, on to the next rank. At 2, we got Shigaraki. He hasn't completely gotten to the level of All For One even during his fight with All Might. While he was completely blind, save for thermal sensing, and running around looking like Darth Vader's retarded cousin, it's still implied that All For One should still be above him. I conclude that based on author's intent mostly, it is clear that Horikoshi is conveying this idea to us, with All For One being built as Shigaraki's own villain to overcome at this point in the story. He's even going as far as to make clear that Shigaraki's body can't even fully harness the power of All For One, especially since he was only 75% through his transformation when he was awakened. Couple that with Shigaraki being stated by the doctor to not be as strong as All Might, it's just the ice on the cake. I am aware that Endeavor says he is as strong as All Might, but that statement is obviously less credible than the one made by the person who literally designed Shigaraki's body. Also, you can interpret Endeavor's statement as just being in reference to Shigaraki's ability to maneuver through midair with sheer strength. So you may wonder, if he's not All Might level, then why is he above USJ Nomu? And that's simple. He'd merely decay USJ Nomu. Assuming 100% Deku was somewhat comparable to All Might in speed, which is a low ball, Shigaraki can easily end the fight without even needing to make direct contact with USJ Nomu. Now at number 1, All For One is basically All Might's equal in every physical way. It took All Might basically using the very last of his power and his strongest attack to beat him despite being blind and with some life support breathing mask. Again, I've explained the narrative implication that would support All For One even during his fight with All Might being superior to Shigaraki. He'd also have more experience with the quirk and mastery of basically all the abilities that Shigaraki has, except Decay of course. This includes Levitation, which will literally make Decay irrelevant from far. It's likely that with a single touch he could take away Shigaraki's powers as a whole. Though there is a prison break in the manga right now, and we're probably going to have some story arc of Shigaraki overcoming and probably killing All For One. So when that happens, don't come back to this video upset, because you never know what could happen in the future. Stain and Muscular can come back and contend with high level characters like we've already seen with people like Miria. But overall, I think it is pretty clear that Horikoshi is conveying All For One as continually being the strongest villain up to this point. So that'll do it for this video. If you enjoyed and have interest in the videos like this, leave a like and comment your thoughts. This list will probably look a lot different depending on what we see in the next coming arcs in the manga. But until then, it's been North. I'd really appreciate if you sent this links to your friends, post it in your Discord servers, anything, post it on your Twitter, whatever. Anyway, I'm out. Peace.